Hello everybody, it's Wyvern here with another bit of Total War Warhammer 2 quick match gameplay. This time around I'm playing as Brettonian against the Dark Elves led by you two on the map, the Pitch Flow. And we are giving a shot to one of those much maligned units of Warhammer 1, the Royal Hippogriff Knights. But these guys did get a pretty significant boost in Mortal Empires. Basically every stat they had got buffed at least a little bit. So we're going to see how they perform here against the Dark Elves, who generally have some decent kit to shut them down. So right out the bat, for my Lord, I am running Bordello, and that is because Bordello is dirt cheap. He's not very... his stats aren't as good as Lewin's, and he of course doesn't have regen, but he's much cheaper on his Hippogriff. He does have a pretty cool boost to mobility for units around him, as well as a slight boost to charge bonus. Plus 10% speed means that his Royal Hippogriffs actually hit 100 speed, which is very nice. They actually did get a speed boost, and we'll discuss the buffs in a little bit. Also, of course, he does have Foe Seeker just for that mobility. Rally, which is a substitute for Stand Your Ground. It's not as good, it doesn't provide a defense bonus, and it doesn't last as long, but it does provide 16 leadership, which is nice. Heroic Killing Blow, which will make him even better at killing large targets than he already is, by improving his alpha damage, as well as just improving his damage, both armor piercing and normal. And finally, the Wrath of Manon, which I decided to bring. I wanted to give it a shot and see how it works, if its effectiveness has changed at all in this last... patch. Before in Warhammer 1, even with the buffs, it was a pretty garbage spell, especially for 200 gold, because all it did really was discourage enemies and disrupt them a little bit, which is generally kind of irrelevant, in my opinion, unless you're playing Terror Bomb immediately after, and even then, it's not that good. But I want to give it a shot and see how it would work. And of course, I did bring a Lore of Life Spellcaster as my hero option, because I needed some sort of self-sustain. She is coming in with only healing spells, Earthblood, Regrowth, a Scroll of Shielding, as well as the Power Stone. Of course, all casters have lost Arcane Conduit, so that's no longer an option. My front line is composed entirely of Battle Pilgrims and Foot Squires. That is because Battle Pilgrims, I assume, and this once again, this is definitely a bit of an assumption, because I haven't done really testing, I'm fairly certain that Battle Pilgrims will outperform Dread Spears and Bleak Swords very, very effectively, and I'm hoping that if my opponent brings Witches, these guys can trade fairly effectively with them, because of course they do have Frenzy and hit very hard, and have decent melee attack and melee defense, which is for their price especially. Foot Squires are just there to provide me with a slight armor piercing option. These guys of course have a bonus against infantry, so hopefully they can lay down some hurt on the high armor Dark Elf infantry, though I'm not really counting on it. I'm not counting on them winning against, say, Blackguard or Nagrond or Hargoneth Executioners. They're more there just as a support tool to slow them down a bit and do some damage. Finally, of course, a Grail Relic, which is basically mandatory, which of course does have its built-in physical resist with Favor of the Fae. It does have a kind of devotion, which is by far the most important thing here, which makes all the units around it immune to psychology and have plus 12 leadership, which is very, very nice. And then my flying contingent, which is really my main striking force here. And the Royal Hippogriffs in this past patch have gotten huge amounts of buffs. They have over 1,000 HP per model, which is very nice. That makes them very tanky. They have 80 armor instead of 60, but that's not all, actually. They've actually also received the Favor of the Fae, or the Blessing of the Lady, sorry. I do believe Favor of the Fae is the effect that affects your whole army campaign, which gives them a 20% physical resistance. So they also got a buff to mobility from 85 to 90. And this has just altogether combined to make them a much better unit overall, in my opinion. They hit, I do believe they've always hit for 130, I do believe, but they hit hard. They have much more survivability than they did before. They're a little more mobile than they were before, and I'm hoping that here against Dark Elves I can kind of terror bomb them, deal with any monsters the Dark Elves might bring in, and if my opponent has Dark Shards to shoot him down, I'll be able to dive bomb onto him and kind of break him up with all my flying units. Now my opponent has brought a very interesting build and an even more interesting deployment, really. For his Lord, he did bring a Dreadlord with Sword and Shield. The Dreadlord with Sword and Shield is of course the melee variant, and she of course does have Noxious Breath, Strength through Spite, which is an AoE melee attack buff, which will help her, as well as the dragon she's flying around with right now, and then Foe Seeker and Deadly Onslaught just for that additional damage. Then we do have the Black Dragon over here, which is basically the same thing as the Dreadlord, except with slightly lower stats. overall. But I was still one tough customer, and with the double tap of Noxious Breath, I'm definitely a little worried that if my blocks of infantry get hit, I'm going to take some nasty losses, and I'm going to struggle mightily in the actual fight. My opponent in the back line, he does have 2 units of Dark Riders that he Vanguard deployed all the way there, and I've actually already spotted them, and initially I turned around Bordelot and the Magoon squad to go intercept them, but then I think better of it seeing the dragons floating around. These guys are a bit of an not necessarily a bad choice against Brettonian, because generally Brettonian won't bring Mountain Yeomen, and these guys could get into your backline, and they'll mess up your backline units, like say archers, Brettonian peasant archers. For his shooting contingent, my opponent has brought a for his infantry contingent, my opponent has brought a very, I would say, cheap build. He has brought a Sorcerer of Dark, and he's actually brought all her spells, which is a little interesting. Generally, I wouldn't recommend that. You're better off stripping down to the spells you think you're going to use, or that you know you're going to use. But she does have the Darkstar Cloak. She has a Spiteful Conjuration, which is a pretty nasty debuff. Darkstar Cloak gives her additional power recharge rate, which is pretty awesome. And so definitely a good support hero there. Then my opponent's front line is Dread Spears, and Dread Spears are a very cheap, cost-effective front line, much in the same vein as, say, Empire Spearmen or High Elf Spearmen and that sort of stuff. Behind that, my opponent does have 3 units of Dark Swords with shields, most likely so they can resist any peasant bowman fire. Because that is always a possibility with Brettonian, that they can bring a decent amount of peasants. And honestly, peasants are probably not the worst. Peasant bowmen are probably not the worst idea against Dark Elves, who don't have that much armor on their lower end units. And then my opponent does have the Black Guard of Nagron here in the back, and this is definitely the most dangerous unit to me, as they do have immunity to psychology and obviously bonus against large, huge melee defense. They're just a monstrous unit overall as far as stats go. 100 armor, they could easily beat the snot out of a lot of my troops. But fortunately, my opponent does not have too much armor on the field. Now he does push forward his black dragons, and here I do get a little worried, thinking that you can see there's the smoking breath coming from them. So I was worried I was going to get hit by Noxious Breath here. And I do start to spread my infantry out a little late, and I'm kind of poking at my opponent back and forth, and seeing that my opponent's infantry is coming out of the woodwork there, I decided to launch the charge. So I got the Royal Hippogriffs going in first, charging straight at the Dreadlord. My focus is then leadership rather than the dragon. I don't really care about the dragon too much. And my goal is simply to knock out this Dreadlord as quickly as I can and put him in the ground. Now I do pop Scroll of Shielding on Bordelot and Regrowth on the Hippogriff Knights, and you can see the Dreadlord is getting knocked down pretty quickly. In the meantime, these Dark Riders are pushing up from behind me, and now I'm moving all my Battle Pilgrims as well as my Foot Squires to simply engage on my opponent's front line and try to crush it as fast as they possibly can. Bordelot, of course, with his bonus against large, is going to be hitting like an absolute truck, though initially he's attacking the Black Dragon, which is a big mistake for me. So I do eventually retarget to the you can see I've popped Heroic Killing Blow, so he's definitely hitting very nastily. My opponent does start focusing down Bordelot with Archer Fire, which is not a bad idea. And of course, now dragons provide a much bigger HP boost, I think, and they also, of course, have breath, so there's a much more significant advantage to being mounted on dragons rather than there's a much bigger boost to being mounted on dragons than, say, griffins or hippogriffs. You can see the Dreadlord, though, is getting torn apart by the Royal Hippogriff Knights, who are just hit like trucks, and they actually have a decent chance to hit because she doesn't have the best melee defense. My opponent does cast a spell here, Blade Wind, but it only really hits my opponent's own Dark Riders and clips the Grail Relic a little bit, which is basically irrelevant. Over here, though, poor Bordelot has gotten clocked in the face by the bombardment spell from the Sorcerers of Dark, and he is actually shortly going to rout, though I do send him in against the Black Dragon, trying to pick it apart. My opponent's Lord does shatter here and simply routs off, and that means that my opponent's leadership is going to be in the gutter. Now, these Dark Riders are trying to cycle charge, but against the Foot Squires, they're not going to do too well, and the Grail Relic is fairly resistant against them as well. In the meantime, Bordelot does actually rout because the Black Dragon is also hitting him pretty hard. But you can see the Royal Hippogriff Knights are just absolutely monstrous here. One of them is actually already leveled up, and the other unit of Hippogriffs has also, I do believe, actually leveled up just now when they dove in on the Dark Shards. And my opponent does pull back his Black Guard, which means this frontline fight is going to go very much in my favor. You can see a Overcast Earthblood is going down, which will allow my Foot Squires to outtrade these Dread Spears very comfortably. Now, there is another ability going down here. You can see Chill Wind goes down. I'm actually not entirely sure. I think my opponent might have actually canceled a cast here. He might be trying to get a Blade Wind off. You can see the Blade Wind does go off, and actually this is a very nice connection. It messes up my Foot Squires really badly, and but then wanders off as, of course, those sorts of spells are wont to do. Bordello, in the meantime, has come back, popped Foe Seeker, and is flying around. You can see the Royal Hippogriffs have dove down on the Dark Riders and absolutely tearing him a new one. These guys are absolutely brutal. Very, very powerful unit right now. These Royal Hippogriffs over here, especially against a non-armor piercing unit. These Royal Hippogriffs over here are picking apart these Dark Shards, just poking at them, being a nuisance. And in the meantime, the Battle Pilgrims, although they don't really stand a chance of beating Blackguard Aggron at all, they are tying him down in melee, and that's kind of what I'm aiming for here. Another Earthblood does go down, healing up these Foot Squires as well, and these Foot Squires as well as these Battle Pilgrims, which will make him much tankier against the Blackguard. And the Blackguard is actually starting to take some casualties, being pinched between Foot Squires from all sides. I do believe there's a bonus, actually, a hidden bonus for flanking. That might be wrong. And these guys are also getting actually picked apart. And you can see the Royal Hippogriffs over here have not lost the model and have already veteraned up twice. Bordello is jumping around like a maniac with Hero Killing Blow popped. Goes after the Dark Sorcerer of Dark here, which is a big mistake on my part because she's actually mounted on a. Do you believe it's is it a horse? It's a horse, I think. I was actually for a second I thought it was a cold one, but no, it's a horse. And she actually hits him in her turn, and because the Dark Elf sorcerers don't have the worst of melee stats, and Bordello doesn't have the best of melee stats, and so I actually decide to take off here and pop her growth on him. Meantime, my Royal Hippogriffs are making a rear charge. Of course, Blackguard is immune to psychology, so they can basically ignore the Hippogriffs, at least as far as the rear charging morale effect goes. But the Dark Sorceress is being routed off. You can see in the meantime my opponent's archers over here, the Dark Shards, and the infantry are all shattering and being routed off by the Battle Pilgrims, who will tear through them. At this point, my opponent's army does simply shatter. So, definitely a bit of an interesting, battle. So definitely a bit of an interesting game there. I was definitely actually pretty pleased with his performance. I do think that if my opponent had decided to field a more Dark Shard heavy build, or fielded, say, Cold One Knights, this could have gone a bit differently. But Cold One Knights are not a very common pick, and I suppose Dark Shards against a faction that's relatively lightly armored like Brettonian do probably seem like a bit of an overkill. I was definitely pleased with the performance of the Hippogriffs. They very much shut down the Dragon, they shut down the Dreadlord, and then they kind of rampaged through my opponent's backline, helped cause terror routes, shut down the Dark Riders, all that sort of stuff. They are still a very expensive unit at 2,000, but being essentially an equivalent of a Dragon for Bretonnia, that's kind of the slot they fill, being a flying terror bomb, but I do believe, well, really, they do cause, without the minus breath attacks, of course, they do cause more damage than a Dragon would, simply because there's more of them. Which means they can distribute their damage a little more. Even with the splash, Dragon doesn't do that much, usually when it crashes into the middle of a group of units. Hippogriffs will do a little more. They still have a good amount of weight, and they can push through targets, that sort of stuff. So I was definitely pretty pleased with their performance here. Bordello did about as good as I could expect. Obviously, you need to bring a Damsel of Life to support him. Definitely the Royal Brettonian Air Force is much better here, I think, with the Royal Hippogriffs being reworked. I'm not sure if it still makes them worthwhile on the for 2,000. They're very expensive, but given that that's only, but given their boost to armor especially and the physical resistance, those two things, in my opinion, have made them much more competitive, much more of a tempting choice. Even if you just bring one as a terror bomb option, it's not a bad choice in my opinion. And yeah, for my opponent, the Blade Wind, actually, you can see it actually did quite a bit of work, especially that second one, 73 kills racked up, and most of that was probably through the spells. Dread Spears do not really stand a chance, though you can see one of the units actually did rake up a decent amount of kills against probably Battle Pilgrims, so that's not bad. The Blackguard and Aggron, of course, performed well, as could kind of be expected against units like that are far cheaper and far inferior in stats. The Dark Shards did very poorly, and they tried to focus down Bordello, which I think was a bit of a waste. They were getting blocked a bit by their own Lord and Dragon, and they might have been better off trying to shoot down the Hippogriffs. The Dark Riders simply got a bad matchup, I think. There wasn't really any backline for them to dive, and obviously Hippogriffs tore through them like a hot knife through butter. And the poor Dragon, of course, as well, though he did focus down Bordello very effectively. After that, got swamped by the Hippogriffs and shattered. Regardless, it was definitely a bit of a fun game. Bretonnia actually outnumbered by the Dark Elves, which was a bit of an interesting thing there. Good game to my opponent. I do hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to leave a like and subscribe down below. If you have any comments, criticism, any questions about Total War Warhammer 2 or a quick match in that or anything like that, be sure to post those down in the comments and I'll respond as soon as I can. As usual, guys, I do appreciate what we're watching, and I will see you all in the next one. Wyvern out.